anyway, I'm excited about this too, because this is a topic that really interests me. Like, when were the documents of the New Testament actually written, and what are the arguments? There's deep division or a variety of opinion on the dating of it, but it'd be interesting to know what are the arguments for each range of date. And also Stephen is going to be covering the oral tradition as well, and address the general issue, are the New Testament documents reliable? So we've had Stephen here once before. He spoke on, did the New Testament writers copy pagan religions? And that was really very interesting. And so I look forward to what he has to say tonight. So just as background, Stephen, Reverend Dr Stephen Spence is the Deputy Principal Academic at Tabor College and has a PhD, of course, and he studied at Fulham Seminary.
In New Testament studies?
In New Testament studies, so this is his specialty. So thank you very much for coming along to speak to us, and we look forward to it. So.
Well, good. I look forward to finally hearing what I think about this stuff too. In prepping, there is just, so many different ways that this kind of conversation can go, so many different levels of detail, so many different questions and things to engage with. So I'm more than happy for you to engage with questions as I go through. There'll be an opportunity afterwards for a longer kind of conversation. But I really wouldn't want to be answering questions that you don't have, or skating too quickly over an area of interest to you. So I'm more than happy to kind of engage with this, and we'll see where it goes. I can talk probably through till tomorrow morning, and only stop then because they'll need this room for something else. So I'm more than happy to go whichever way you want, but it struck, I never read the advertiser. I want to say that up front. I'm not endorsing the advertiser at all. It was only a mistake that I picked it up this morning. But there was an article in it by Brian Morris, the director of Plain Reason, that was just right on our topic. And so I thought I would engage with that a little as a kind of way into what the conversation is about and why it's kind of an issue. In New Testament studies, this would be kind of considered under the persistent myth of the mythical Jesus. It just seems to be that time and time again, people go back to this idea that the Gospels are unreliable, the Jesus is a myth or non-historical, or we know nothing about him. They just make this kind of assertion. And Brian was in the paper this morning doing that. And I've got a couple of quotes I want to just respond to get the framework rolling. But today, with higher education and scientific knowledge, people have finally recognized that Jesus is a mythic fabrication. Two things there: higher education, the idea that if you get educated, you stop believing this kind of stuff. Statistically, that's just not true. It was true for Window in the 60s. When people got educated more, they started attending church less. There was a graph that showed that. But that was to do with sociological change, and they were moving from one kind of social group into another, and that affected the church attendance patterns. But now that most people in the West have a higher education, that kind of correlation has disappeared. The higher educated you are, it's not likely that you believe less than someone who is not done higher education. So the idea that higher education means that you're no longer stupid enough to fall for the gospel stories is just a fabrication. It's not a statistical reality at all. And scientific knowledge, what has scientific knowledge got to do with the historical Jesus? The historical Jesus is a question for historians and historical method, not scientific method or scientific knowledge. So he's just thrown those words in because it's meant to sound somehow more sophisticated. If he was as sophisticated as he thinks he is, he might talk about historical knowledge and shifting historical knowledge, but scientific knowledge is not the issue. You cannot treat history like science, and you don't treat science like history. It's a different discipline. So it's just, it's trying to use language just to dress up his point of view. He says, since the Enlightenment, a rising tide of doubt has surrounded Christianity, the Bible's authenticity, and Jesus. He references On the Historicity of Jesus by Richard Carrier, an historian, and describes his book as groundbreaking. Now, I just want to observe that groundbreaking and a rising tide since the Enlightenment don't actually go together. If it's groundbreaking, it's new. If it's been a rising tide since the Enlightenment, this conversation has been done over and over again. There is nothing new in the kind of claims that are being made. In fact, in scholarship, the conversation was hard back in the Enlightenment and subsequent to that. This conversation has gone on at the top levels of the academy within the university, not just among Christian believers, but among historians, classicists, the whole gamut of people who study this kind of stuff. And the kind of ground that they've got back to is stuff that's just been done over and over. And the reason why New Testament scholars don't get into a flurry over this kind of book is because it's not groundbreaking. The things that it talks about is stuff that has been dealt with and redealt with time and time again. So there's nothing particularly new in this. But he does observe that in meticulous detail, he reveals an endless theme of pious fraud in the Gospels, Acts, and Epistles. As merely one example, Carrier points to the irrefutable proof that only 7 of Paul's alleged 13 epistles are genuine. It is true that in New Testament studies, there are 7 Pauline letters that are granted authenticity beyond all others, and there is dispute over 6 of the others, although Hebrews isn't counted at all by anyone. But the idea that somehow this is new information is just disingenuous. And the idea that it's irrefutable proof is just ignorant. There is a huge conversation that's based around the Greek language and the kind of vocabulary that Paul uses, the kind of theology that's there, the kind of references that are made to other parts of Paul's career and stuff. So there is a lively conversation over it. And yes, there's quite a there's no conversation over 7 of them. But those 7 start in the late 40s and go through to the mid-50s, and so offer us a very close written connection to the events of Jesus. And in there, Paul, in these undisputed Paulines, there is reference to the historical Jesus, there is reference to Paul meeting with people who knew the historical Jesus and receiving the tradition from faithful witnesses within that span of time. And so the suggestion that's left there that there's no kind of evidence from Paul that relates to the New Testament can't be trusted because there is some dispute over the authorship of some of Paul's letters is just wrong. I mean, if he knows enough to know it's wrong, then he shouldn't write it like that. And if he doesn't know enough to know that he's written it wrong, then he shouldn't be writing it. I mean, it's just not a reliable description. And the fact that all references to Jesus are by visions, hallucinations, and together with his followers speaking in tongues, I take to mean a reference to Paul, Paul's references to seeing Jesus in his letters, in which case, Paul is writing post the resurrection of Jesus, and so he's going to describe it in language that is similar to vision kind of language. Paul doesn't claim to meet the historical Jesus. His letters don't claim it. And the suggestion that somehow Jesus isn't real because Paul didn't see him in the flesh is just out of touch with what Paul is actually writing about. The four Gospels were written by unknown authors up to 90 years after Jesus' alleged death, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Carry this endless tampering of translations, edits, and recopying up to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD and beyond. If there are different edits, translations in the 3rd century, and we in scholarship know how to get past those to the text behind them, and we do, that's the signs of textual criticism is well attested. What is the point of that statement? We're not using text from the 4th century to talk about Jesus. We're using text from the 1st century, and that's where we're getting our information. And if some of those texts have had some variation to the way that they've been copied, well,
Big deal.
Big deal, no deal. I mean, it's just not relevant to it. It's just part of trying to create a sense of it's unreliable. When we're not saying that the story of Jesus is reliable because of 4th century text, we're saying it's reliable because of access to the information we've got from the 1st century. So again, it's just the contemporary biblical scholars now view Jesus as a mortal Judean preacher who was later deified. Is Christians believe in the full humanity of Jesus. So a biblical scholar who says that Jesus is mortal is just expressing basic truth. The next in which Jesus' divinity was recognized is a question in terms of how it's understood before the resurrection and after the resurrection, and there's a lot of discussion within biblical studies about that. But this idea that, which would suggest that the Jesus before the resurrection and Jesus after the resurrection are totally separate, is just not consistent with where contemporary biblical scholarship is. That's a very lively conversation that picks up on the nature of how the early church responded to the resurrection of Jesus, how the historical Jesus understood himself in terms of his mission for Israel and to Israel and stuff like that. So it's just it's just misleading. Dr. Carey and other historians conclude that Jesus was simply created as a celestial figure in exactly the same way same tradition as pagan and Greek gods before him. And like many other gods, he was later written into history. Now, at this point, his arguments become unclear. Is it that there is a historical Jesus and who has been later deified, or is there a deified Jesus who has somehow been written into history? I mean, he's having it both ways, and he shouldn't and can't, because that's just not possible in the time frame that we are talking about between the death of Jesus in the year 30 and the perhaps writing of Mark in 64, there's not time for them to have developed a celestial Jesus and then written that back into history. And as I say, the argument the other way, that Jesus has been recognized as divine, well, yes, that's what creates the faith of the church, the recognition that Jesus was divine, and that's something that happens after the resurrection. And what the church says is not that Jesus becomes divine after the resurrection, it's that we recognize it and we see in what Jesus was doing, his divinity revelation of God, the image of the invisible God. But the idea that the church worshipped a celestial figure and decided then to historicize that historical figure in the time frame, given that we've accepted that Paul's earliest letters is in 49 and he's dealing with a historical Jesus, is just not plausible. And the reference to the Greek gods is totally it's not a reasonable analogy. But to get into Greek religion would probably take us a little further afield. And so he ends up with, on this analysis, the entire Jesus narrative is factually flawed. And that's kind of what we'll be trying to look at and explore today. But there's just way too much information on this. And so, like any halfway decent teacher, I say read a book. It would have helped him if he read a book, and it will help you if you read a book. And so I've suggested two in particular there. The historical Jesus 5 views. The first view is by someone who doesn't believe that there is a historical Jesus. And then the other 4 writers respond to the arguments that they make. And then there's 4 views about what level of information we have about Jesus, and then the other 4 authors respond to that. So in terms of seeing the conversation, and a conversation that involves someone who doesn't accept that there was a historical Jesus, this is a useful overview kind of book, but it is an overview book. This is kind of first year New Testament studies kind of book. For the not for the faint-hearted. Or did I not bring it down? Oh. Well, not for the faint-hearted, so you probably may not want to, but this book, Key Events in the Life of the Historical Jesus, has a very detailed chapter on the nature of history and how it works, the science of history, the method of history. Very detailed, and it gets to then what we know about what we can know in terms of Jesus. And then very detailed work on 12 events of the life of Jesus that just covers all the historical reason for believing that believing's the wrong word because it makes you think it's an act of faith. But as historians, why you would use this evidence about these events in the life of Jesus as historical data in which to make a conclusion about who Jesus was and how people responded to Jesus and what Jesus said. So if you want to get the detail, this book. If you want the overview, that book. And those are only 2 of a library of them. I own some of them, but I only own shelffuls of them. There are libraries of them. And there's plenty of information for you to pursue. But the idea that somebody has come along with a groundbreaking book that somehow suggests that there's no connection between Jesus of Nazareth and what we know about Jesus is just suggests that they haven't done much reading. So I want to start exploring something about the Gospels. And what I want to say here is that there is a difference between a survey of the New Testament and an introduction to the New Testament. Introduction to the New Testament is a technical term that refers to exploring the background of the Gospel, whereas a survey of the New Testament actually just describes the content of it. So a survey course will tell you what's in the various books. An introduction actually looks behind that to the who wrote it, who did they write it to, the when was it written, what sources did they use in the writing of it, where is it likely to be from, and what region of the New Testament world, what genre, what content does it have, and why was it written. And why was it written has two kind of aspects to it. What occasion it, what sparked the writer to write, and then why did the writer write? What did they want to achieve by it? So these are technical, historical questions, and there is an endless amount of detail in that. And I own way too many introductions to the New Testament because I don't know why. Because I teach the subject, and I'm always looking for the next book on that. I buy too many books. That's a confession, but remember, this is treated like a confession and don't tell anyone, just in case it gets around back to my wife. An introduction to the New Testament. This one is 1992, it's an old one, by Carson, Moore and Morris. The reason I mention this one is because it spends a whole lot of time in the detail of the who wrote it and when they wrote it. Stuff that, by and large, I don't really want my students spending as much time on. I'm more interested that they engage with the text and the occasion and the purpose side of things. And so the one that we use in class has a bit more on this. But Carson, Moore and Morris are heavily focused on the who and the when kind of questions. So if this is a particular interest to you, then this is a good book. There's actually a newer version than this by Carson and Moore that were written after Leon Morris died. But there are sources for it. But you could buy 15 introductions to the New Testament, and that would cover the spectrum from New Testament scholars who have no interest in actually being Christian to people who have come from a very particular faith perspective. They all write introductions to the New Testament. You can read all that. But one of the simplest ways is to actually use the Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. This is second edition, and it just came out this year. And this is the dictionary that you should own. If you don't own it already, then Christmas is coming. Is there only 13 Fridays to Christmas or something? Something like that. So get this on your Christmas list. And there is chapters on all of the Gospels and the writings that give you kind of detail. But there's also articles on the incarnation, the death of Jesus, the criteria for authenticity. How do we know what we know about Jesus? This is the one book that would be useful to you.
Is there a Kindle edition?
Pardon?
Is there a Kindle edition?
I'll check and find out. I suspect there is.
Yeah, I suspect there is. It's an IPP book, and they're going ebook format.
I don't know what to do.
But the yes, but you probably should own the ebook and the hard copy, just so that you've got one at home and one with you, just in case you need it. I just want to talk briefly about who wrote the Gospels. And these are the a stylized form of the 4 evangelists. They're called evangelists because they wrote the evangel, the good news. It doesn't mean that they're evangelists in the sense of going out to convert people. It just means they're writers of the good news. So there's 4 evangelists: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in the church tradition, they're identified with Matthew with a winged man, Mark with a lion, Luke with an ox, and John with an eagle. And there's reasons for that if you're interested. But let me say that there are none of the 4 Gospels themselves identify Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John as the author. And to say that the authors are unknown is to treat the 1st century as if it's the 21st century. It's to say because we don't know the names of the authors, that they didn't know the names of the authors. So just because a text doesn't have a name in it, doesn't make it anonymous. It just means that we spent a whole lot of time arguing about the name of the person. There are different reasons in the church tradition for why these names have been attached to each of the Gospels. And we could kind of explore them. But I want to suggest this evening, so that we can kind of move on, is that part of the reason we care is because we think that somehow the author, if we know the author, that somehow that will make the tradition of the gospel more reliable. Like if we know that John wrote it, then that must make it true. If we know that Luke, the companion of Paul, wrote it, then it must be true. But it's not the actual author who makes it true. It's the reliability of the tradition that they're using that makes it true. And what we need to explore is not, can we 100% prove that Luke wrote his gospel? It's, can we say that the tradition that is used in Luke's gospel is reliable? And that's a different question. But if you get caught just arguing over the name of the gospel writer, you're going to be in a loop that doesn't particularly lead anywhere. Does that make sense to you? Or do you have a question? Yeah?
But if Matthew and John actually wrote it and they were disciples, then they're eyewitnesses.
Yes, but that doesn't make the... see, John writes a very different gospel from Matthew that has Jesus speaking in different kinds of ways. So in terms of which one are you going to pick, and why would you pick one over the other? Or are they both reliable in different ways? So we've actually we get back to the actual tradition within the Gospels rather than the author. I mean, if John is a disciple, and there's a fair few that will pick John, the disciple, as the one behind John's gospel. It's not undisputed. There's a lot that wouldn't identify that. But if John's written a very different kind of gospel, a kind of interpreted story of Jesus. And so what we would be arguing, what you end up arguing is that interpretation a reliable interpretation, and how would you determine if it was reliable, rather than it just being John himself. So just because you've got a disciple writing doesn't actually guarantee the information in it. The information in it, we're looking for support from other ways.
So in 1 John 1,
Yeah.
and I presume it's
Yeah.
the same author, he says, that's which we've seen, that's what we've touched with our hands, that's which we've heard concerning the word of life, this we proclaim to you.
Yes.
So he's claiming a very empirical standpoint.
Yes.
Saying, I'm an eyewitness who actually heard, saw, and touched.
Yeah. And why do you believe him?
Eh?
Why do you believe he's?
Well, it's a big issue from the point of view. If that's not true, then the guy's a fraud.
But that's,
Well, no.
but that's his point.
Yeah.
His point is, it's not that it's John, you're not basing your belief in that because it's John, you're believing it because he's giving you evidence within the text that I am an eyewitness, I've got empirical evidence, and let me show you I know about this particular column or whatever. So he gives eyewitness evidence within the tradition itself. The fact that he is, not a disciple like Mark or is a disciple like John is actually a much more secondary issue. You'd much rather be spending your time actually looking at the text itself to see whether it shows veracity rather than worrying about the actual
In a sense, I don't care if it's
Yeah.
John or not, but the point is he claims to be an eyewitness.
Exactly, yeah.
Perry?
He does claim to be an eyewitness, and therefore we may, in our 21st century way, say he has empirical evidence. But even in that 1 John letter, he states that he's got that in a very poetic way. So you get that, two people come out of an event, and one of them is the sort of organised librarian type, and the other is the one that borrows all the poetry books. They recount things quite differently.
Yeah.
So we don't have to be, it doesn't bother me that he writes poetically.
Yeah. Yes. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we don't want to shift the conversation from the gospel traditions that we have to an argument about who might have written them and how we name them. But we are dealing collectively with the tradition to see if it's a reliable witness to Jesus of Nazareth. So this is one of the reasons why Carson Boone Morris, in a sense, is no longer first choice in the in Intro to New Testament Studies, is because they spend a whole lot of time arguing about this stuff, and in the end, it doesn't actually advance what you know about how faithful the tradition is. There's more discussion to go beyond that. But we'll circle back to this kind of conversation in a moment. Now, this you will recognize as the introduction to Luke's gospel. And Luke in this is giving us a kind of window into the fact that even if the authors whoever the authors are, there is a variety of tradition that they are using in order to convey the stories. So Luke says that many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us from those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So there's many that have started to try and create an orderly account of this. And there's a tradition that's being handed on and passed on by those who are eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So there's there's an oral tradition, there's written tradition. There's a variety of sources that are being used here, and Luke is taking advantage of them all by investigating everything carefully from the first to write an orderly account, so that he might know the truth of the things concerning the things that he has been instructed. Eyewitnesses and servants of the word are actually not two separate categories, but one category, eyewitnesses who are servants of the word. And this picks up the idea that in Acts chapter 1, there are 11 disciples because Judas has betrayed Jesus and is now dead. And so they want to replace that 12th disciple. And they say it has to be someone who has been with Jesus from the beginning, from his baptism in John to after his resurrection, because they will act as an eyewitness, an authoritative account reteller of the Jesus story. And so we get evidence there in Acts that the story is not just set loose. There's an expectation that the eyewitnesses and those who are ministers of the word, those who have received the tradition, will ensure that that tradition is accurately passed on and retold. So that it's not that the information is just scattered and people can kind of believe what they want. It's that there are eyewitnesses and eyewitnesses who are servants of the word. There are those who have started to create orderly accounts. So Luke is using sources in writing his gospel. There's something that lies behind it. And this is somewhat of what lies behind it. This is sort of a map of what goes on in the creation of the four Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and the letters of Paul over here. So we start with Jesus. That's kind of obvious, but it's not to be forgotten. We start with Jesus, and what do we start with Jesus doing? Teaching, speaking, performing miracles, doing stuff. We don't start with Jesus writing a text. We start with an event, not a text. The basis of Christianity is not a text, it is an event, Jesus. And so the Jesus event gets from there into our written accounts by being retold. You cannot get from Jesus to the text without retelling the social memory, the oral tradition, it's called. And so commonly Jesus' death is dated around 30. Did the followers of Jesus write anything down before the death of Jesus? Well, we may not have anything, we certainly don't have any physical evidence of that. But it's certainly plausible that they wrote down some stuff, but even more plausible that there was information circulating about Jesus. We know Jesus was followed by some disciples, but we also know there were disciples that stayed in places. Think Mary and Martha in Bethany. So can we really imagine that the only people interested in what Jesus was saying were the people that were traveling with him? People would want to hear the stories of Jesus. What was one of the things that Jesus did with his disciples during his ministry? He sent them out to proclaim the kingdom. And what did they say when they proclaimed the kingdom? They said the stories and the sayings of Jesus. So even before the death of Jesus, there is information circulating about Jesus. There is the repetition of Jesus' stories. Now, something to consider. Did Jesus say things more than once? And he did say them more than once. Did he say them exactly the same way?
Most teachers say things in various ways pretty much to every class, don't they?
You've been in my class, so you know that's true. But there is, when you speak, there's a kind of common core. There's some common phrases that you use. But around the edges, there are different ways of doing it. So, Jesus is speaking the same thing more than once. What's the authorized version of what Jesus is saying? Is it the first time he says it? Or is it the second time he says it? When does it become gospel? Huh? Is it possible that even within this circulating tradition, there are different ways of remembering what Jesus has said? Now, in our culture, we fix that by using a tape recorder or putting it in writing. And we then fix it. But in the first century, tape recorders are too big to carry around and so not easily used. And we're talking about people who are largely illiterate, which makes it sound like they're lacking something, but so let's put it the other way. They are oral people. They speak and they re-speak events. And they do that collectively and often. And that information is what we mean by the traditions of Jesus. So right at the beginning, there is some degree of unfixedness because the nature of event is that it's not fixed. When you go from this event tonight, your memory of it, your way of saying it to different people will be different. We have a electronic version by which we can compare what you said, but in an oral tradition, there is no record to go back to because it's an event. And so what makes it the authorized event, what you've heard and what you've heard is slightly different, but you're both retelling the event. If you're slightly different, that doesn't make me disappear and this event not happen. I don't just disappear in a whiff of uncertainty. I was here, and I did say stuff, and there was a hearing of it. And so the imprecision or the fussiness around the edges of it, of the oral retelling of the event, doesn't make the event untrue, and it doesn't make it unreliable, because everything in our life, practically, is based on our remembrance of it. And we remember it well enough in order to base our life on it. It's reliable even if it's not precise. It doesn't have to be precise. I don't have to remember precisely what I said to my wife when I proposed to her to know I'm married. And I can't go home tonight and say, if you don't remember what I said when I proposed, then I'm taking that as too uncertain to build my life on. And so could you please leave, because I don't want this stranger in my house. If you're building a bridge, you want mathematical precision. But in life, by and large, we have a degree of plus and minus about it. Now, it's possible that what is known in New Testament studies as quell, quell is a German word for source. And there's evidence that, now this is the four-document hypothesis. I'm not going to argue it, I'm just going to describe it. But it's felt that Matthew, whoa, that didn't work. It's felt that Matthew used Mark, Q, and his own source of tradition, M. So Matthew has access to information that some others don't. He has access to Mark's Gospel, and he has access to Q. So he's using three kind of basic sources. Luke uses Mark, Q, and his material, L, his special material. The parable of the Good Samaritan doesn't appear in Mark, doesn't appear in Matthew, and so it's identified as belonging to L, Luke's special tradition. That special tradition may be written, or it may be part of the oral tradition, or a combination of that.
Surely, Stephen, his insight into Mary's thoughts, the very visit, etc., surely there must be some tradition, either Mary herself or one of the brothers of Jesus who knew Mary's version, that somehow must have been that source.
Yeah, and that's one of the ones in L.
Yeah, so L could be written and could draw from Mary, or it could be oral, if depending on how you read things. But if Luke is from Antioch, which is a possibility, and some of the disciples went to Antioch, then he would have access to a source of tradition. He talks about eyewitnesses and investigating, and so the L can be written or oral, and it can come from before the time of Jesus through to later. So it's in the background, so we don't know exactly where to place it, but anywhere from the time of Jesus to the pre-writing of Luke, this material can be either collected together or oral. Now, which would be better? If you're Luke, which would you prefer, written or oral? Don't say written because that's wrong. So which would you prefer? Why is written wrong?
It's not personal. You don't have feedback.
You can't interrogate the speaker. So in the first century, which is largely an oral culture, most people don't read or write, and they have those who can read or write have varying degrees of capacity in it. Most material is conveyed orally. And in an oral culture, if you're speaking to someone and they tell you the story, you can ask them about it. If you've got a text, you don't have that. So oral is trusted in this culture over written. Whereas in our culture, we trust written over oral, because oral can change. We're looking for written. We're trying to get it static.
Surely the Jewish tradition of having scribes, I think back to Jeremiah, and he was making sure that what he prophesied was written down. So certainly the Jewish culture, there was surely a tradition of being recording things like with the scribes, etc.
That's not what the artifacts kind of suggest. We don't have we have evidence of written stuff, so things like there are contracts that are written, and so the scribes do that as a kind of business kind of connection, and so there's evidence of that kind of writing. There are evidence of letters written from people, but there's not the evidence of a recorded kind of stuff. There is evidence that in an oral culture, people will write themselves notes to help them recall and to speak, but they're not supplements to speaking, they're aids to speaking. So it's possible that even in this time, some people are making notes, but they're not writing gospels, they're making notes.
I guess just to clarify what your point is, you're not saying that they didn't, when you say that they prioritised oral sources over written sources, you're not saying they dismissed written sources. What you're saying is that oral ones were considered better. And even in the New Testament, we see that in Paul's letters. Like Paul writes in his letters things like, well, look, I'm making do by giving you this letter. I'd much rather be there talking to you, but this will have to do. It's not that he dismisses the value of letters, otherwise he wouldn't write them. It's that the value of having an oral eyewitness kind of conversation with someone and being able to bounce it back and stuff like that will always trump over a written source.
Yes, we only have Paul's letters because he couldn't get to all the places he wanted to go to. The preference would have been for oral communication. So Paul didn't write it down because he needed them to get it right. He wrote it down because he couldn't be there to tell them himself. So and what I'm trying to say is you need to kind of shift your prioritizing of written over oral. And people who criticize when the Gospels are written are actually anachronistically putting written records ahead of the oral records in terms of its reliability or trustworthiness, whereas in the first century it was the other way.
But now the oral communication is totally useless to us, isn't it? The written's all we have.
Yes, and so what we're doing is at the point, what is the occasion for writing a gospel? One of the reasons is that you're trying to pull together that which you're beginning to lose in terms of the eyewitness accounts and stuff. So in terms of dating Mark, it's felt, or it's a common framework, to believe that Mark is actually putting into writing the teachings of Peter. And there's reasons for that. Carson Moore Morris will kind of give them to you. But Peter's is believed to have been executed by Nero 64 in that kind of on the fire of Rome kind of persecution. And so Mark is dated somewhere in the mid-60s on the basis that explains the occasion for why we have moved from oral to written. So that Peter would have gone about preaching. We know that Peter got to Corinth. We know that he got to Rome. He was a traveling apostle, speaking the gospel. And what Mark does is inscribe it, write it, because that is going to be lost. So that starts to become the occasion for it. It's not because they don't trust the oral, it's because one of the eyewitnesses that they're using is going to be lost. And so that becomes the occasion. So that dates Mark in the early 60s. We don't have evidence of the Gospel of Mark being quoted by anyone prior to that. So, I mean, like if Paul quoted something that was in Mark's Gospel, we could date it by that. But there's nothing on that. And the big event in the first century in the Jewish Christian world is the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And generally it's felt or agreed that there's no reference to the destruction of the temple in Mark, and so that makes it pre-70. So they're using those kinds of markers to date Mark in that early mid-60s kind of area. You can get scholars who date it earlier than that, but by and large the majority, conservative, evangelical as well as others, would date it in the 60s, early 60s. Right? If that's the case, and Matthew and Luke rely upon Mark for part of their Gospels, then that makes them post Mark, post mid-60s. And generally that puts Luke in the low 70s, and then Matthew in the mid-70s, and John is dated later, but I'll get to that in a moment. Now Luke writes 2 volumes. Luke Acts. Acts finishes around the year 62. Why does Acts finish in the year 62? Is it because that's all that Luke knew, or because that's where his story comes to an end? Because his story is not about the life and death of Paul. His story is about the gospel making it to the very center of the world. And he gets to the center of the world in Acts 28 in the year 62 before Paul is executed. So there's a narrative reason to stop there.
It doesn't even mention his appearance before the emperor, because like the gospel is to be proclaimed before kings. So why wouldn't he show that?
Because he's already put Paul in front of governors and stuff like that. So there's no direct narrative need for that. And and Acts finishes with Paul preaching unhindered the gospel of Jesus and the message of the kingdom. And so that works in the narrative in terms of Luke. You can see as Luke tells the story, he's telling about the word of God being proclaimed. And here it is at the center of the world. So most scholars will accept that it ends at 62 because that's where Luke's story ends, rather than on the death of Paul, which would be a bit of a downer or whatever, and actually shift the focus of what he's writing. But if, and this is the kind of argument that goes on, if you date Acts to 62 because Luke doesn't know the end of the story, and so that's why it stops there, then Luke's gospel is prior to that, and Mark's gospel then must be prior to that. So you start to get a date for Mark maybe in the early 50s. Right? Matthew is dated alongside or a bit after Luke for reasons that it really doesn't matter too much, except that if you move Luke back and you move Mark back, then you would move Matthew back as well.
Because Matthew and Luke seem independent.
Pardon?
Matthew and Luke seem independent.
Well, no, they have Q in common.
Yeah, they have Q in common, but they haven't seen each other.
They don't do collaboration.
Yeah, but the collaboration is identified as Q.
Yeah. But like
So,
if you shifted Matthew too far away from Luke, then Matthew may have had access to Luke, or vice versa. and there doesn't seem to be evidence of that. Like their nativity stories are entirely different. So,
yes. I mean, that's not unreasonable, it's just an argument from silence. And arguments from silence, like if Luke knew Matthew's birth narrative, he would have incorporated it or referred to it somewhere, or Matthew would have referred to Luke's.
fix up with genealogy.
We don't know. But my point I'm trying to get at is, even if you move Luke to 50, we're still looking to the old tradition for the authenticity of the material. Right? We're not got the writings of Jesus. So the question of authority and authenticity and reliability relies on this area, not particularly whether or not we date Mark at 50, 60 or 70.
Sorry, Steve.
Yeah.
The other option which you already raised, of course, 70 CE, the
Yeah.
destruction of the temple. If it's applicable to Mark, surely it's also applicable to John, Matthew, and Luke. But none of them mention the destruction of the temple, which surely would argue for an early date for all three.
Yes, that's certainly part of the discussion, but part of the discussion is whether or not Matthew does know about the destruction of the temple and whether Luke knows about the destruction of the temple in the apocalypse that Jesus is
Olivet discourses.
and in those Jesus is prophesying. So he's speaking forward about something. But the question is whether or not the way that Luke and Matthew shape that indicates whether they know of the destruction of the temple. And because it's not a direct reference, it then becomes part of the disputed issues. So there are some who think that Matthew does know of the destruction of the temple. Luke makes a reference to fleeing that is somehow reminiscent of it or something. But
Doesn't that assume that prophecy can't happen?
no, well, it's not just that. It's not that Jesus prophesies the destruction of Jerusalem, because that's not for a Jewish prophet, that's not a big ask. Because I mean, that the Romans would destroy Jerusalem wasn't too hard to predict. But it's more the way that they've shaped the description of it that alludes to it. So again, this is part of what is disputed, and you spend a lot of time arguing it, and this is what scholars do. Spend a lot of time arguing about it. I would suggest that they spend so much time arguing about it, they often forget to read it. And Mark would have been a little disappointed that they hadn't actually read it because they were so busy trying to date it. But the reason Carson Moon Morris put so much emphasis on trying to get the date right is because they connect the date with authority and authenticity. The earlier they can date it, the more authoritative or reliable it will be, because they're putting reliability on the written text rather than the oral memory, the social memory, the oral tradition that lies behind it, where Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John would have all put the authority. Does you reckon?
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that authority of an oral tradition and account. If it's direct, one-to-one from an eyewitness, that's fine. But an oral account, of course, to replicate it, can go through a number of people. So I know of someone who knew someone that saw Jesus do this. Isn't as good as a piece of writing that says, I saw Jesus do this, and this has come from one person.
Yeah, Chinese whispers.
That's what you're saying, yeah. They were better at it because they had a whole.
No, what's the
history around
rules? No,
reversing
It's
it.
about how
What's the rules for Chinese
It's
whispers?
about how directed.
What's the rules?
Only one person hears.
Only one person hears. You can't ask question. The person who said it isn't allowed to comment back. So you immediately cut off your eyewitnesses and servants of the word. That you separate them from the story. So just by you create those rules, because if you have a feedback loop built in, you're not going to end up with the difference, and it's not funny anymore. And the Chinese whispers is about getting a laugh at the end because the beginning and the end is different. But in social memory, they're not trying to get a laugh at the end. They're trying to pass on important tradition. And so it is nothing like Chinese whispers. And the fact that some people suggest it is because they haven't actually stopped to consider how oral communities work. And it's to suggest that every society before the printing press was somehow childish in the way they handled material, that they couldn't devise rules and practices that reliably passed on tradition.
What about the fact that when you're telling a story in an oral tradition, you are trying to get a message across and you might bend things a bit to suit your purpose?
Yes,
I think
and you
people
might.
are writing too.
And you might. And the issue is, what is wrong with that? Because in our culture, we've created this simplistic antithesis that separates an event from its interpretation, that separates memory from legend, and separates fact from fiction. It is as if you can objectively capture an event without interpretation. But just by the very act of engaging an event, there will be interpretation. At the moment, you are processing what I'm saying by attaching it to stuff that you already know. Because if you don't know who Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are, all this information is just flooding past you, and you're not able to hold it. The more that you know about the kind of stuff I'm talking about, the easier it is for you to organize it. You start to see where I'm coming from, what my particular perspective is, and you compare it to your previous perspective, and you start to... But that's how you hold things in your memory. You don't have a photographic memory. Memory is not a tape recorder. It's an urban myth to think that people see and remember, and that remembering is about reproducing what they see rather than reconstructing what they remember. We know, and this is a major new area in New Testament studies, that looks at the new neurological psychology stuff of how memory works. And so Rob McIver, who's an Australian scholar, has pulled together the new research on the nature of memory. It's being used by Anthony LeDun, Michael Bird, another Australian scholar, how the early church wrote the story of Jesus, Eric Eve, Behind the Gospels, Understanding the Old Tradition. This is the lively discussion that is going on in New Testament studies, is to explore the nature of memory. How does memory work? And what the evidence suggests is that all memory requires some kind of interpretation. You can't have objective memory. I was going to say even cameras have a focal point. Now we've got cameras that don't have a focal point. You can actually pick your focal point later. But let's go back 2 years, and there wasn't that. These cameras had a focal point. What you remember is what you focus on. You cannot remember what you don't observe, don't focus on. It's not like you will go away from here and be able to just recreate the event by re-seeing the picture in your head. That picture in your head will be created from what you observed. If you didn't pay attention to what the person next to you was wearing, you will not be able to recall that.
That comes to the other thing. The problem with the word interpretation is that it sometimes implies that it is inherently false. That
Yes.
to have an interpretation of something, well, that's your interpretation of it, is sometimes implied to mean, well, that's not that's a distorted thing. But the thing is that interpretation fundamentally means meaning. It means that you give a meaning and you see significance in the event. And the thing is, you might have justifiable reasons for thinking that that has meaning and significance.
Why
So,
do you remember the sayings of Jesus, not the saying of
I'll go
Joseph?
down the road.
Because Jesus is significant to you. If you don't think Jesus is significant, you never remember a word he says, you don't repeat it to anyone, nobody listens to you, nobody repeats it, and because it was an event, it's lost. If somebody in the ancient world wrote something, and we find it 2,000 years later, we think it's important. But if it's been lost for 2,000 years, how important was it? I mean, if it was important, somebody would have repeated it and carried it through. All we've got is an accident of history that particular thing is remembered. The sayings of Jesus were important to these people, and so they remembered it. Collectively, they remembered it.
I think this stuff is really useful because I know a lot of my non-Christian friends who like to think they've thought more about this stuff than anyone in the church for the last 2,000 years. But I think what Stephen was saying was that when you I've got my interpretation, right? And then I pass it on to someone, they've got their interpretation. They pass it on to someone, they've got their interpretation. It's not the same as Chinese whispers, but there can be I guess what some people today love the word evolution. There can be an evolution of nuance.
A development, yes.
Yeah, right?
Yes. And what this stuff is saying is that has happened, but that's appropriate to it happening. Because, and it does, if you know the end of the story, you tell the middle and the beginning differently. And that's why history, political history, that is written in newspapers is different from political history that is written by a political scientist 10 years after the fact. Because there is, the direction it takes, and that shapes how you hear it. So back to Jesus, he's the resurrected Lord, and so you see things in the stories, and you highlight things in the story that is appropriate to that. Your remembering of it is important to you, and that's why it's being redone. If something is unimportant to you, this is just what happens with social memory. If it's not important to you or to your group, it is forgotten. It's not written, so it can't just be found later. It's just lost. And the reason we have the stuff in the Gospels is because they found it useful to them. Right? Does that mean they created it? Only if you think that you've got a choice between an objective description of an event and an interpreted event. Okay?
Yeah. So that point standing, that there's a development, right? I still think that Well, my understanding, and,
Yeah.
and maybe that can be revised, but my understanding is that even so, back then, they were accustomed to learning to recite things in a way that we just aren't.
Yes and no. There's reference made by a Swedish, Nordic, somewhere in Europe scholar, whose name...
Your memory's unreliable.
It is, and well, yes, that's right, you've just looked at your watch. You've just looked at your watch, and that's not the only thing unreliable about me. And he argued that rabbis got their students to memorize Torah, and so he argued that Jesus did the same with his disciples. Except we don't actually see that in the Gospels, there's no actual reference to that.
What about Lord's Prayer?
Which is in 2 forms.
No.
And so what the rabbis did was post 2nd century. The rabbis don't exist at the time of Jesus, it's the Pharisees who exist at the time of Jesus, not rabbis. And what those people are memorizing is from a text. And so lots of people can learn lots of the Quran, lots of people can learn lots of the Bible by memory. But what they're learning is from a text, because that's what you keep going back to, because that's what you're memorizing. But in an oral tradition, you're not memorizing a text, you're retelling an event. And so in that, what we're looking for is the key parts of the story being told properly. And in the tradition of Jesus, there are lots of parables and short sayings and miracle events and exorcisms and stuff. These tend to be in memorable pericopes, segments. And they lend themselves to retelling. And it is possible to retell it and to get some of the edges different, but have the core the same. And what memory research teaches us is that people can remember important events and things of significance to them. But they tend to remember a basic core. 80% of it is reliable, and 20% is on the edge, and it's remembered differently. And the retelling of it can change that kind of 20% and stuff like that. But the 80% remains stable, even across a long period of remembering. So it's not like it starts at 100%, and then goes down to 0 over time. It's that it quickly moves to 80% and then stays at that across time.
I hear what you're saying, Stephen, that this seems to be aimed at an individual's memory. But we do know that the disciples, until at least Stephen's death, were probably past it, were actually collectively sharing their memory and no doubt rubbing the edges off anyone that
Yes.
had forgotten something or took a different interpretation.
And we've got a good illustration of that, because Peter evolved his story a bit crooked at one point. He started to take the Jewish customs as important to the Christian followers in Egypt, in Greece. And he was picked up by the other disciples and said, no, you're wrong. We were saved by faith, not by circumcision and not by how we clean, wash before we eat and so on.
Was that actually Paul?
Well, are you talking about Galatians chapter 2? See, Galatians chapter 2 is a really good example because it makes reference to Paul's trip to Jerusalem. And scholars spend a lot of time arguing about what trip in Acts is related to Galatians chapter 2. As if Paul doesn't remember, if the two don't line up, then it can't be true. But the core of the event that Paul and Peter argued is solid. Just because you have bits on the edges, was it which trip to Jerusalem did it precede or follow, doesn't actually change the core event of memory. And that's the reliability stuff. This is a map of the, I really had to stop, I just don't know where because this stuff keeps going forever. This is a map of the first century Christian world, and these red dots represent churches. These churches are spread from Jerusalem through to Rome and everywhere in between. Most of those churches are coming to birth before the written Gospels. But they were born out of the stories of Jesus. And Paul, when he writes his letters, doesn't retell those stories of Jesus because they are known to the communities there. So those churches are all telling and retelling the stories of Jesus with confidence. Nobody's arguing, quick, let's write this down, or can we get an authorized version from the Jerusalem Bible Society? They are using the tradition with variation, probably. I mean, we see it in variation between Matthew, Mark, and Luke when they tell the same stories, with variation, but the core is there. And what I guess I'll try and stop here. What I'm trying to say is we can spend our time arguing about the edges on the false assumption that if one part of the story is different, then none of the story is true. When we know for a fact that is just not reality, and we should actually be getting on then with engaging with what the core of the story is. And when it comes to the core of the story, where Jesus not just proclaims the kingdom, but proclaims himself as the one who brings the kingdom, is the king of the kingdom, then there is there's no room for us not to be able to engage faithfully and directly with Jesus. This is not about denying that everything in the Bible is exactly picture perfect, because nothing is picture perfect. Even in a picture, you've only got the bit of the picture that you've got. Nothing is full. And every telling of Jesus is a remembered telling of Jesus. This is what Jimmy Dunn spoke. Remember Jesus. And Jesus had such an impact on people that they remembered him. And their memories of him are a collective memory of him. And that's why you don't read just one gospel. You read 4 gospels. And the church in the 2nd century tried to cut all 4 down to 1. That got kicked out because we want the 4. Then somebody else came along and said, well, we're only going to pick the one for Gentiles. We'll throw out the Jewish ones and let's stick with Luke. That was kicked out because we need all 4. And in my personal Christian experience, I have a personal preference for Luke's gospel. And just because I have a preference for one gospel doesn't mean you can kick out the other 3, because it's a collective memory of Jesus. We need all of them. We need to be listening to all of them, engaging with them. And if we do that, we will indeed meet with Jesus. Not just the Jesus of the past, but the Jesus of the present. Because in the end, the Jesus you meet is the Jesus of the Gospels, but it's also the Jesus of the living experience of the church. And it's also the Jesus you meet directly as the living Lord. Those collectively inform our experience of Jesus. And
that's got to be the way that you can avoid swallowing camels while arguing about maths.
yes, and I think I personally, now this is a personal thing, I personally think that it's a trap for people who are opposed to Jesus to get you arguing about the edges rather than focusing on the reliable, faithful core of who Jesus is. Anybody who actually reads the gospel and engages with the Jesus they find there will find a life-changing Lord, as opposed to people who spend their time arguing about names and dates and places and stuff. So maybe I should end there. Okay, everyone, now listen carefully. I don't want to end up with 4 different versions of this. This is a Jesus of a literate culture, of our culture. That's a joke we can make. It's a joke that would make no sense in the first century, because as soon as those people move away, they will have multiple things, and collectively they have a reliable tradition of it. I should have stopped half an hour ago. I don't quite know what that's going to do to your carefully organised plans. They're going to lock the doors at 9, so
No, they're not.
the cleaner is sick today, and unless they organise something different with you, you've got a key. There you go.
And you haven't?
I have, but I don't plan to stay around till 9:30 to finish off. I got work tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, thank you. You've been a very engaged appreciative thing. And I'm more than happy to talk about the details and stuff.
Oh, you're not escaping now.
But,
Stephen, Josephus, we do have independent records of the Lord Jesus, and then is it Tacitus the one who talks about
Yes.
the Nero's persecution of the Christians? So within 30 years we have evidently, in the capital city, enough folks that at least a Roman historian takes note of the fact that these guys were,
Tacitus writing at the beginning of the 2nd century,
Okay,
referring
yes.
back to 64.
Okay.
And what Tacitus is doing is referring to Christians, and he makes reference to the fact that they worship one who was crucified. But at that point, historically, it's difficult to prove that he's not just reporting what the Christians are saying, rather than that he has...
But is he the one, though, that refers to the gruesome things that Nero did to the Christians?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So, I mean, there is a record that of the significance that he's...
Well, there's a record of Christians.
Yes.
And there's a record that Christians followed Jesus.
Yes.
But that's not historically more valuable than all the stories we have of Jesus.
But,
And the idea, part of the idea behind that is that somehow he's independent and therefore can be trusted, and which means that the Gospels are not independent and therefore not to be trusted. But historicity is every part of historicity is interpreted, and so no one is more or less biased. What we've got to say is, does that information fit with the big picture or not? So, and Josephus is a kind of a special case, because Josephus is a Jewish historian writing in the he's writing in these 80s, in that kind of area. But he's writing for a Roman audience, and he makes reference to James, the brother of Jesus, and his death, and he makes reference to Jesus, and he describes him there in terms that is consistent with the gospel accounts. But in terms of Josephus studies, there's a fair amount of argument as to what the original text is with that particular passage. Because before the printing press, every document that is reproduced by hand. And if you add something into a document that is reproduced by hand, you can't tell where it was added in or not. And so there's an argument over whether or not Josephus sounds too Christian in it.
Except the second reference, which I do understand, is more as a passing reference. Look, I've talked about this guy already. You don't need me to reintroduce him. So it certainly seems that...
Yes, and so, I mean, this is part of the discussion of whether or not there is a historical Jesus. But to me, you've already conceded, not you, but the argument has already conceded that the Gospels are not reliable, and therefore we need a Jew or a pagan to reference Jesus to make the tradition plausible. But there is so much Jesus tradition that there's just not a plausible generating source for it. The information is wide, of different types. So you've got parables, you've got miracle stories, you've got conflict stories, you've got sayings, proverbial kind of sayings and stuff like that. So you've got multiple different types of sayings. You've got them coming from Q and from L and from... so you've got multiple historical sources for it. And to postulate a from nothing background to it is just it is an argument. The way the argument works is that you have to be skeptical of absolutely everything, and that book on the 5 views, the first guy, he is skeptical of everything, and so you can read.
Is he a scholar who writes in journals, or?
I don't quite remember, but he's in the book because he's of.
Because I've heard it claimed that those who claim that Jesus is mythical are basically just the rat bag element, and that there is no historian who writes in journals who would support that view.
Well, I guess there's this guy. This guy that was quoted in the paper this morning. He's a historian rather than a New Testament scholar. So I've never heard of him, but he might be someone. But I guess what I would be saying is that in terms of New Testament studies, we have been debating this since 1720. Is it?
Bit of a boring debate.
Strauss. It's been going a long time, where people wanted to say the church made Jesus up. And in terms of scholarship, it's been argued and re-argued and stuff. And so the only place you really get this now is on the internet. Mm-hmm. And you get it on the internet because the internet doesn't abide by any of the scholarship rules where you need to know the evidence. And Larry Hurtado, who's a New Testament scholar and runs a blog, he's continually saying to people who comment on it, if you don't know the Greek, if you don't know the history, if you don't know method, if you haven't had your ideas tested by other scholars, if you're not prepared to get in there and do the work, why do you think that you should be listened to? Just because you've got access to a computer? Do the work. And if you do the work and you think that you can demonstrate something, then other people will take you seriously. It's not like New Testament studies is controlled by a group of believers. There's a fair number of people in universities teaching New Testament studies because it is an interesting historical subject, not because they have personal faith. if you can demonstrate a view, make an argument, people will take it seriously. But if you're just offering an opinion based on, no, I hope I don't offend anyone. Well, I don't actually mean that. But what I mean is, if I offend you, I'm pretending that I didn't mean it. It's like those people who say that you shouldn't immunize your children because they will get Down syndrome or whatever it is, autism. The AMA comes out and says that's not the case. They've done scientific study after study and said that's not the case. And then somebody will say, yes, but I know someone who was immunized and has autism. And so they put it together, and because they can point to one person who has both, therefore it must be cause and effect, and therefore it must be true of all things. But the actual science is to go back and actually find out, was there a link between the immunization and that child having autism? Can you show a link? And so there's a science to it. And it just seems to me dumb to say to professional medical researchers, you've missed the obvious. You missed that child who has it, and therefore it must be true that immunization leads to autism.
And all the other research that you've done...
It's without value. And I saw it on a TV program. And in that TV program, the child got immunized and got autism. Must be true. And on the internet, you can't stop that kind of thing circulating, but it doesn't make it into the medical schools because there is the evidence against it. And I think there's a parallel there of this kind of conversation.
Sorry, Stephen, David Alina was here, he would take up you straight on about the AMA. Of course, quite recently there's the issue of abortion. They had this professor from America who's done the correlation with breast cancer arising apparently. And the AMA immediately said, no, we know the AMA is getting public funding to do abortion, so you've got to be careful.
But we do get the point.
Yeah.
But
that's not...
But
it's not the vote. But
there are...
Because it can be coloured.
But anything can be, yes.
Both interpretations can be coloured quite easily.
They can, and I was going to use some climate science, and I thought that might be even less convincing to some.
Evolution creation will do.
That too.
Yeah, we're unified on that, aren't we?
But I guess my point is that it's not my experience that people who study something are ignorant of the key piece of information that has been discovered and is available on the internet. And that's why these books are written rather than just being internet posts. It's because there is an enormous amount of work behind them. And yes, they don't all agree, but they all engage with one another and take one another seriously and stuff. And a book like The 5 Views doesn't try and hide the fact that somebody out there is a minimalist. It gives them space and lets them engage and respond, and it's just that their arguments are not persuasive or convincing overall. They might persuade some, but they're not persuasive to a larger group that kind of know the details. For somebody to look at.
When you said there are people in the universities that are non-believers but still are studying like New Testament studies, are they mostly believing in Jesus but just not?
Or you mean that there is a historical Jesus?
What form does their non-belief take?
They don't follow Jesus as Christians. I mean, they're not part of a faith.
So they do believe in the historical Jesus.
Yes.
That's taken as read, but they don't perhaps believe in miracles.
Like Bart Ehrman is a good example.
Yes.
He's an agnostic, near atheist.
He started off as an evangelical and lost his faith. Michael Bird started off as an atheist and found faith. And they've both written books. Ehrman on a range of books, but on that journey, and Bird's written his kind of book. So there's, but yes, New Testament studies, particularly in like the UK and in the university systems in America, is a lively discipline, and people enter into it because it's an interesting field. So I get into it because it's a faith issue for me, and so I was interested in that. But there are others who just follow through the kind of
it's like studying
education.
Egyptology or anything else, isn't it?
Yeah, and so when New Testament students, the biggest meeting of New Testament scholars in the world is the Society of Biblical Literature that meets annually in North America. And you have Jewish scholars, you have Christian scholars, you have non-Christian, people of no faith. Now they have other religions who are interested in that kind of thing as well. And they're all there, and the conversation is about the evidence, not my personal faith in Jesus or my personal non-faith in Jesus. It's about the evidence. And this is why I don't think it's like the church has kind of created a bubble, and that bubble is going to be popped by somebody coming along and saying, "Oh, you made it all up." No, people have been popping that bubble for a long time.
Bubble for a long time.
Yeah,
It doesn't seem to work.
It doesn't work. And as we move through in terms of our understanding of the nature of history, every historian has a interpretation of what they're telling. You can get 10 accounts of Bill Clinton. Which one of those is true?
Monica Lewinsky's.
Well, whatever one you read, we all know he was the president.
So the difference is doesn't change. There's fact there, but nobody can talk about Bill without a particular spin on it anyway. And so what we're looking for when you're looking for evidence is collective evidence. And that's why I think it's a good thing that we have 4 Gospels. One of the things in your notes I've got in there is an extract from the Proto-Evangelion of James, I think, or something. The birth narrative of Jesus, written in the late 2nd century. And it tells the story of the young Jesus. It tells the story of the young Jesus. At the top of page 4. So this little child, when he was 5-year-old, was playing at the ford of a brook. And he gathered together the waters that flowed there into pools and made them straightway clean, and commanded by his word alone. So this is the 5-year-old Jesus with miraculous power. And having made soft clay, he fastened thereof 12 sparrows. And it was a Sabbath, and when he did these things. And there were also many other children playing with him. And a certain Jew, when he saw what Jesus did, playing upon the Sabbath day, departed straightway and told his father Joseph, Lo, thy child is at the brook, and he has taken clay and fastened 12 little birds, and hath polluted the Sabbath day. And Joseph came to the place and saw, and cried out to him, saying, Wherefore dost thou these things on the Sabbath, which is not lawful to do? But Jesus clapped his hands together, and cried out to the sparrows, and said to them, Go. And the sparrows took their flight, and went away chirping. And when the Jews saw it, they were amazed, and departed, and told their chief men that which they had seen Jesus do. Does that sound like an authentic story of Jesus?
No.
It's got Jesus, it's got conflict over the Sabbath, it's got miracles. Does it sound like authentic Jesus stuff? And it doesn't. There's no prehistory between this late 2nd century and Jesus, so you've got this huge gap with no reference to it. You've got Jesus acting in a way that is inconsistent with all the other stories of Jesus. And historically, it's not plausible. You could argue that it is, based on the fact that somebody wrote it, but it has no no back history to it, no explanation for why it turns up then and not in any of the other kind of texts. And I put that with two sayings in Luke. Jesus says, whoever is not against you is for you. And a different saying, whoever is not with me is against me. Now, which of those sounds like the historical Jesus?
In different contexts, both of them.
Well, they're both there, right? And see, so the tradition is able to hold a Jesus who says different things. There's not an attempt to flatten him out and just pick a one Jesus that we could all agree on. They bring both stories in because Jesus is capable of saying different things. Blessed are the peacemakers. That sounds like Jesus. Do not think I have come to bring peace on the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword.
Well, I struggle
that
with
sounds
that
like-
some.
Yes.
The reason that sounds like Jesus to me is because, it's in there. And
Yes.
and it's, you know what I mean?
There will be wars and rumors. And look, until
Yeah,
this-
but
Sure. I can see that there are wars and rumours of wars, and I can have no trouble hearing in my imagination Jesus saying that. But promoting it is something quite different, and I find it difficult to hear that in my
Yes.
imagination.
And what I'm trying to say there is that the tradition held both, because it was consistent with the Jesus they knew to be able to say both. Jesus comes to bring salvation, but also judgment. So there's that dual aspect.
His kingdom is not of this world; it's up there. What happens in this? Yeah.
Well, no, that's not what John meant. John meant that the authority of Jesus' kingdom comes from above, comes from God, not from Caesar.
Otherwise, my people will fight.
Yeah.
So we're not to fight on this world necessarily for that.
And yet he brought a sword.
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah,
your
anyway,
point is priorities.
Yes.
See, from the writer's point of view, what Matthew and Luke there are willing to put things that seem contradictory because they're of their list of priorities. So if their priority was, we want a nice, neat Jesus that everyone will think is nice and consistent and never says anything confusing, so everyone will like him, well, that would be one thing. But if they're saying our highest priority is to accurately represent the Jesus that we've encountered because he's worth representing accurately, because our bias, based on our eyewitnessing him doing pretty flipping amazing things, is that he's really important. Therefore, our highest priority is to represent him even when it's a bit messy.
So
And that kind of thing, because it's got to be accurate.
It's better to take all of that into the tradition and then try and understand what it means than to flatten the tradition because you are creating Jesus. Like if you were creating Jesus, you would create out from a kind of core, and you would control what comes out from that. But what they've done is take these and allow both sides of that to come. So the example from the late 2nd century stuff, that just doesn't sound like the Jesus of the Gospels.
It's too neat, too fancy, too slick.
It fits with what we might create if we thought,
It sounds more like something the Quran would say.
Well, I'm not getting into that. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yes.
Anyway.
But it's not inconsistent with the kind of stuff that you get in the late 2nd century.
It's what Dan Brown made.
Yes.
$1 million or whatever he made.
Yes.
They're trying to fill in the bit which we'd like to know.
Yes. If Jesus is God and he was 5, what would a 5-year-old God do? And so they kind of cry. You can see how they create it. But when you look at the gospel tradition, you don't see that kind of stuff. The closest you have is the story of the young Jesus in the temple. But what you have there is a prodigious religious child engaging with people about the law, the stories of Israel, the scriptures of Israel, in a very kind of plausible way. The one that runs into troubles with his parents over where he is and stuff. There's a kind of concreteness to that kind of story, as opposed to this turning mud into clear water and then setting sparrows, clay sparrows.
That story is also quite problematic from the point of view, like, didn't he show any consideration for that his parents might worry about it?
Yes, I mean, the look story, I actually think that proves that your child developing an independent way of being from the family is not a sin, but it's just part of being a child moving into adulthood. And I think when we say that children, just being children, are examples of original sin, I think we've misinterpreted what Jesus is doing there. Being a child means there are going to be times when your parents don't understand you.
But in the cultural context, he just about had or was about to reach bar mitzvah, by which stage he was in fact considered an adult within the Jewish culture of the day.
Yes, that's kind of true. Although bar mitzvah is maybe not a first century thing, but it's kind of true. But what I would say is, what we're not trying to look to explain or justify Jesus. What we're saying is that Jesus is without sin. This is how he behaved. Therefore, that's what defines sin for us, rather than us saying what is sin and then trying to make the story of Jesus fit there. It's just it's a choice.
I'm still back at the idea of two sayings about the same thing in the Gospels. That's not only like the Old Testament, though, is it? I believe there's two invasions of Canaan, two stories about David and Goliath, even perhaps two.
I'm not sure about that. If Aaron was here, I'm sure he would nail that. But yes, in Chronicles and Kings, you have dual accounts of similar narratives of the same event. In the Synoptics, which is more my area, you definitely have dual accounts of the same event. And you have a choice in terms of how you approach the Bible, is to decide ahead of time what the Bible must be like. And if you decide the Bible cannot have two different accounts of the same event, therefore you then choose to harmonize it or whatever.
There's a really obvious example where the Ten Commandments are listed in two places.
Yes.
And they are completely different. The first six look about the same, but the rest look hopeless.
Yeah, and if you go the other way of working from the text out, so we look at that and we say the text is capable of describing things similar but different. Therefore, what it means for the text to be faithful is similar but different. I mean, it doesn't have to be 100% the same. There are three tellings of Paul's conversion in Acts, and they're all slightly different. It looks so stupid that he didn't realize that the second and third account were different from the first. What was he thinking? Or maybe because in his context, telling the story in three ways is okay because the story is the same event, and what he's emphasizing is slightly different bits of it because that in that context of that part of the story, that's the bit that he wants to bring out.
I was trying to think of a New Testament example, like a gospel example, and I was thinking of the time when Jesus says, "Who do you say I am?"
Yeah.
Now, in each of those three accounts, so Mark 8 and everything, all of them emphasise different aspects of that, but all of them remain very consistent in overall points of him asking, "Who do you say I am? Who do other people say that I am?" and that kind of stuff. But the other thing, and this comes to your point about interpretation, is that none of them record Jesus saying something like, gee, it's a hot day today, or, gee, that walk was a bit long, or that kind of thing. And that's because when you're doing interpretation, you're always focusing in on the things that have significance and meaning to you. And so therefore, that's why when we say, oh, well, it's their interpretations, that doesn't nullify their value, because if they were just recordings in a dry sense, we'd have all kinds of junk in there that we didn't care about.
It'd be even more boring than Chronicles.
Yeah, and so
don't get into Chronicles. It's not fair. But yes, nobody remembers everything. And if you've listened to somebody tell a story in which they try to put all the details in, and they can't because you just can't, but that they're trying is a pain. Who baptized Jesus?
John. Or was it the Holy Spirit?
In Luke's Gospel, John is in prison when Jesus gets baptized. John goes to prison in 3:20. Jesus is baptized in 3:21. Because in terms of the narrative, Luke is rounding out the story of the Baptist, and then he's moving on to the story of Jesus. So the narrative creates a kind of framework or need for the story to develop in a particular way. But does that mean Jesus wasn't baptized? Because in Mark and Matthew, it's clearly in John, Jesus doesn't actually get baptized. Because it's John there and John's in prison in Luke, does that mean that Jesus didn't get baptized? No. Jesus got baptized, but the point that is being made in Luke, the point is when Jesus is praying at his baptism, the Holy Spirit descends on him. So Luke is connecting prayer and the Spirit and Jesus. That was more important to him than the Baptist, because he had already dealt with the Baptist. In Mark, he just tells the story. In Matthew wants to be certain that you don't think that Jesus is a sinner and therefore needs to be baptized for his sin, and so he says that this is to fulfill all righteousness, and has a kind of explanation. So they each take a different tact to the story, but the core of the story is indisputable. And what becomes, and this is in the Key Events book, how significant is it, and this is that Jesus chose to be baptized by John the Baptizer? What was he doing by going all the way from Nazareth down to the Jordan outside of Jerusalem, which is a bit of a trip? Why did he do that? To identify himself with John. And why was John baptizing in the Jordan and not in the local pool? Because Jordan is the boundary marker for coming into the land of Israel, the God's land. And so by baptizing the Jordan, you're kind of re-entering, you're becoming a new people of God. And so Jesus chose to go down and associate himself with this new eschatologic end-time prophet of John, because God was doing something new. And that is what New Testament scholars are really interested in. What does that mean for when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God is at hand? Those kind of things, rather than the argument over, did Jesus really exist? Because he didn't baptized him, therefore he didn't get baptized, therefore he doesn't exist. I mean, those arguments are just
annoying.
A waste of time when there's real stuff.
Well, in one sense, it's a waste of time, but since so many people are believe that it's a genuine issue, it has to be addressed because it's a barrier to faith.
Yes, and that's an apologetics issue, and I know that a lot of you are interested in apologetics and stuff like that. That's an apologetics issue in terms of how do you address the barriers to faith that people have. It's not so much a New Testament issue, but I guess what I hope is that the more that you understand what's going on in New Testament studies, the more equipped you are to make decisions about the apologetic stuff, where you put the weight on it and how you engage with different stuff, and whether or not you find yourself caught up in that kind of dead-end conversation, or whether or not you find a way to move to a more useful conversation. But identifying what people's barriers to beliefs are is important, and for some people it's these kind of issues, so I get that. But I think mostly it's a kind of smoke screen that gets in the way, that people are using. It's like a magician who doesn't want you to look at something, and so gets you looking over somewhere else. And I think it's a kind of distraction, because if we see Jesus, we have to make a response to him. I mean, this is a kind of common question in the Gospels. Who do you say that I am? Who is this Jesus who stills the waters? Who is this Jesus who forgives sin? Who is this Jesus who speaks with authority? Who is this Jesus? That's what the Gospels want you to kind of engage with. And to that end, they give you all these stories of Jesus for you to engage with, rather than just being caught in who is Matthew, when did he write, and that kind of stuff. So
it's smoke screen for some. I think there are people who will come to believe eventually, but it's harder for them to get there because they assume that they are reasonable arguments, and that therefore.
Yes. Yeah, I mean,
and that's the power of a good smoke screen, though.
Yeah.
I mean, a good smoke screen is all about. I mean, if the magician was to say to you, "Don't look here for a minute. Look up here at my fingers up here," or something like that, no one would buy that. It's the genius of the magician to actually make you all want to look up there and be fixated on there while he's doing everything down here. And the trick with this kind of stuff is to, make it so that that's a big deal for the flashy light up here is the big deal that you want to be watching, and part of our job as apologists, we've got this trick. Sometimes we've got this decision to make. Sometimes it's actually good for you to say to people, let's talk about why that's not actually worth you looking at. Let's really analyse that for a text. But and so in this case, sometimes we do need to really flatten out why the historical Jesus questions are really worth arguing about. But then often, what's a better option is to say, don't even waste your time looking up there. Look down here at what he's doing with his hands down here. And so, part of what we need to do is the kind of stuff that Stephen's saying is stop worrying about this. Try to snuff that really quickly. And say, actually, it's much more important for you to get to here, because once you've actually shown that Jesus rose from the dead, once you've shown that Jesus, all the rest of the really important things, the fact that he was a historical becomes just obvious anyway. I mean, that's implied by all the rest of the stuff.
The problem is to get people to look in the first place, because a lot of them have this prejudice. So
exactly. Yeah.
Yes, and yes, and that's an apologetic kind of method question and stuff. I personally would go with salt and light in the world. People start to take what you believe seriously when they take you seriously. If you are following Jesus, people will actually take seriously. If they take you seriously, they'll take what you believe seriously. I mean, that's sociology kind of stuff. But I guess I would say that by and large, the Jesus of the Gospels actually doesn't call you to believe in him. He calls you to follow him. And one of the things that we've done is actually shift it to, let's believe in Jesus. And you can do that standing still. But following Jesus is actually what it's about. So the believing is about following, not just an abstraction kind of thing. And so the challenge is to actually get people to start engaging with a Jesus who actually calls them to follow. Yes, you have to do all the pre-stuff and whatever, but you could keep your eye on the goal and keep pushing through to that. Yeah.
I think we better
Yes, we
call
sort of.
quits at this stage.
You guys have been way too polite by staying beyond my bedtime. So yes, I appreciate you your effort.